Hello. Thank you for coming to the reading. My name's Cisco, and I've written some stuff. I started writing, actually there's a small enough group, so usually, if you don't really know me well, this is kind of a bit of an affectation. So I actually speak a little bit normal, but being Minnesota and looking like this, I can't approach people and say certain things. Because if I go up to someone and say, oh my God, I love your costume, they're like, like, this is what pepper spray smells like. But if I'm like, oh my God, I love your costume, no one's afraid of T-Rex. So I can just keep it kind of mellow, which is nice. Thank you so much for spending part of your afternoon here in Wordslingers. So I started writing because I used to work in broadcasting. Before that, I was in music on the road, trying to be a rock star. It's a whole thing. That's for a different panel. But I got off the road, started working in television, and I was working in news, and I really wanted to branch away from nonfiction into fictional writing, narrative storytelling. And I had developed a character called Billy Badass, mostly because I did hear that line in the film Reservoir Dogs. And I thought it was cool, and I wanted to make her like everything I couldn't see, because two of my favorite characters of all time, across all genres, are Wonder Woman and Tank Girl. And I hadn't seen anything like that since, and I was missing, I was like, there's a lack of like non-dude, awesome character stuff out there. So I created Billy Badass, and I wrote this massive treatment for what was gonna be the greatest science fiction movie of all time. Well, television movie. And I went across the hall, because I was working in news, and I was like, hey, I'm a TV guy, put this on TV. And they're like, that's not how this works. And I found out that, yeah, it's really, really hard to go from nonfiction to fictional storytelling. But I stayed with the character for almost a decade, at which point all of my friends were tired of me talking about it. And so they said, you should write this stuff down and put it out. I did. It was received well enough. And here we are, 15 books later, still doing the thing. So with readings, since I wasn't an author from the start, like I said, I kind of fell into it from television, I don't do them the right way. I tell a lot of anecdotes, because I could stand up here and just read to you for an hour, but my books are kind of short. And if I read you the whole book, then you won't want to pick it up yourself. So I do excerpts, and I tell little stories. Sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're not. I usually make really bad jokes, like how they used to call me white girl in college. Yeah, I see some questionable looks. Actually, I don't see anything, so I'm just going to pretend that some of you are like, what, white girl? Well, it's because, as we learned in middle school, you are what you eat. And that's why, yeah, there we go. All right, thank you, a little rim shot. And to keep it tight and interesting, instead of reading from, a little bit from all 15, I'm only gonna focus on the books that I've released between the last CONvergence and this CONvergence, which is 3 books. One is an anthology, called Nowhere Sleeping, because I'm a bit of a transhumanist. Like whenever you read a vampire novel and they're talking about how like the curse of immortality, I'm like, you're doing it wrong. If you don't want to live forever, then your life sucks. I want to see everything. I'm hoping for 2101, because then I'll be old, and the news will come talk to me, and they'll say, hey, like they do anytime someone lives to be over 100, and they say, hey, like, what's your secret? And you always get the 2 answers, right? There's like the stupid milquetoast, like, well, it's good living and have family and yada, yada, all that crap. And then you have like the fun ones, like, don't die. And those are fun too. I want to be the middle person and just make stuff up. Because what are they gonna do? I'm like, you want to live to be 124? Here's what you gotta do. Drink so much whiskey that you piss brown. Like, just have a lot of fun with it. All of which is a roundabout way of saying, so I'll be reading in chronological order from their release, starting with Nowhere Sleeping, which is an anthology series, which is, they're individual short stories, but they're connected by a similar thread around the themes of like, what is life? Because if we only think life is valuable because it ends, then is it really life we value, or is it the end of life? And so that's a fun question I'm playing with. After that, we'll be reading one excerpt from my children's book, which is called Before a Sleepy Fall. I grew up reading a lot of Edgar Allan Poe and Edward Gorey, scary tales to tell in the dark, like the darker stuff, and I noticed that they didn't have a lot more dark, creepy things for kids anymore, so I was like, I'm gonna add some dark stuff out there, but also with a sci-fi Afrofuturistic twist. So I'll be reading a bedtime poem called Charles, and then finally I'll be closing out with my latest release, The Unbodied, which is the 3rd and final chapter in what was an accidental trilogy, and I'll talk more about that as we get to it. So this is an excerpt from Nowhere Sleeping. Oh, quick plug, I do have a meet and greet tomorrow. because I'm so inaccessible and hard to find at cons. And sorry, that's a joke. I realize some of you don't know me. I'm actually very not inaccessible and extremely easy to find at cons. So if you swing by the meet and greet and you're like, yeah, I like that No We're Sleeping, I actually have too many. So consider this a bribe. Come on by, say hi, and then you can walk away with the complimentary paperback. Although I don't want to call it paper because it's actually like a cardstock. A cardstock back. Card back. Stock back? Yeah, there you go. Card back stock. So the premise of No We're Sleeping is that there is a young person named Aurelio Wallace. He is a journalist of sorts, and he has been tasked with interviewing Coral Bentley on the eve of her 400th birthday because she has decided, after 4 centuries, enough of this. And through their interview, she tells different stories. If you're familiar with H.G. Wells, he's a little indie writer. He's done some stuff. He wrote a book called The Illustrated Man, which used a similar narrative device, and I really liked it, so I kind of borrowed it. And in this excerpt, which I did notes just for you all, because usually I just get up in free flow and then kind of forget what I'm supposed to do, and then it gets really awkward, more so awkward. And yeah, this is an excerpt from Nowhere Sleeping, page 10. That's where I'm at. Yeah, okay. Oh, nestled. There you go. I also give myself cues for where to start. Nestled in the cosmic grandeur of space, Deimos, the smaller moon of Mars, has become a haven for the extraordinary. It's a world where the horizon bends with the curvature of space and the stars are close enough to touch. Here, amidst the stark beauty of the Martian moonscapes, lies the Asaph enclosure, a place where the rich and reclusive carve out their utopias. As Aurelio traversed the tranquil corridors of Coral's residence in Deimos, he couldn't help but marvel at the juxtaposition of ancient wisdom residing in a place so futuristic. In his career as a journalist with a reputation for unraveling the profound mysteries of the era, he was no stranger to embarking on historic journeys. However, this time was different. Coral Bentley, the oldest living human and a relic of a bygone era, had made the baffling decision to retire her consciousness into a digital archive, effectively ending her physical existence. The purified air was charged and quiet, as if history itself were waiting to exhale its final breath through the lines of Coral's story. Upon meeting, Coral's presence was both commanding and ethereal. Her eyes were timeless windows to centuries past, and they regarded Aurelio with a gentle knowingness. Despite her extremely advanced age, she exuded a vibrancy and sharpness that bellied her years. The strands and tufts of her thick silver hair encircled her face like a halo, and beneath the intricacies of her forehead lines and cheek wrinkles, her eyes were bright and piercing. As they sat opposite each other, the room bathed in a soft artificial light, mimicking the familiar vibrant tones of Earth's coastal sunsets. Aurelio began the interview, his voice steady and direct, but tinged with respectful curiosity. Many years ago, Coral, your debut novel, The Spiderleg Garden, erupted onto the scene, hailed as both a literary triumph and a scandalous provocation. Now, here we are, communicating across the vast expanse of space. How does life on Deimos compare to those Bloomsbury days? Ah, Bloomsbury, Coral smiled. Those were the days of youthful naivete. Deimos, on the other hand, is like living in a snow globe, serene, isolated, but you know you're just a curiosity on someone's shelf. Well, I must admit, Aurelio continued, I'm a bit envious of your successes. I can't think of a writer who isn't, but I have to ask. The Spiderleg Garden was a phenomenal success, yet in all this time you never released a follow-up. Why? Why ruin a good mystery, Aurelio? Coral adjusted her shawl. Anything I'd written would have been competing with a ghost, and ghosts have always had the upper hand. Well, speaking of great mysteries, Coral, Aurelio sat up straighter in his chair. Your decision to transition into a digital existence is as fascinating as it is final. Why now? Why choose to leave this remarkable journey of life? Oh, Aurelio, Coral's laugh was light, yet it carried the weight of ages. That's no great mystery. My dear, life is not just about duration, but about depth. When I was born, hybrid cars were just catching on with the public. Now I live on a Martian moon. I've witnessed humanity's leaps and stumbles, and yet there's one constant throughout it all that cannot be rectified. And that is loneliness. Loneliness, Aurelio leaned forward, his journalistic instincts peaked. But history has shown us countless souls who embrace solitude, thriving in their own company. You misunderstand, Coral shook her head slightly, a knowing smile playing on her lips. Loneliness isn't about physical solitude, Aurelio. It's the quiet despair of feeling disconnected, unseen, even when surrounded by thousands or in a group of your so-called peers. It's a silent cry in a world bustling with life. Take the incident at Fulfillment Center 42, for example. Fulfillment Center 42, Aurelio shook his head. I'm afraid I don't know what it... Those centers were quite a bit before my time. Well, Aurelio, Coral leaned forward, let me tell you a story that perfectly encapsulates the heart of my decision. Perhaps then you'll understand the reason I've chosen to transition into the realm of digital eternity. Now see, this is where most authors are supposed to like cut it off because like, oh, that's a hook. Because as a potential reader, you're like, I want to know what's next. Fuck all that. We're gonna, flip all that. Sorry, I forgot the camera's up there. So a little excerpt from the first short story in the collection of short stories, Fulfillment Center 42, which is life, the universe, and everything, because nerd. Imagine for a moment that you had to describe yourself without demographic markers. No racial indicators like black, white, or multi-ethnic, no cis, het, or trans, no gay, ace, bi, poly, or pan, no American, African, Asian, or European. Strip away the colors, the origins, and the titles. Remove all the societal labels assigned to you. How would you describe yourself then? The real you, and more importantly, would you want to? See, my most defining trait is that I'm ugly. Now, this isn't a self-deprecating sentiment, but rather an objective observation. There's no negative connotations nor positive affirmation to it either. It's merely a truth, and I accept it as such. Ironically, it's more my acceptance of my appearance than my appearance itself that others find unsettling. Most folks refuse to accept facts, preferring asinine platitudes like, everybody is beautiful. But the fact remains that if everybody is beautiful, then nobody is. There's a freedom that comes with embracing your own unattractiveness. If someone lacks the intellect and genuine self-acceptance to acknowledge who they actually are and what they actually look like, it lets me know right away who to avoid. I work best with folks who don't have time for delusion. Unfortunately, some of the most delusional folks I've ever met work here at the Fulfillment Center. See, now that's a hook, that's a cliffhanger. Like, who is this ugly piece of garbage that's gonna, yes, sorry. But yes, that was an excerpt from Nowhere Sleeping. Thank you very much. So now, fun anecdote time. I wrote a children's book called Before Asleep You Fall. It's a little darker and it's sci-fi, which is usually not what you find in children's literature, although that's a really big word for what I've collected here. But it's a collection of bedtime story poems. I was also a big fan of a writer named Shel Silverstein. Yeah, he did a few things you may have heard of. And I love the idea of doing narrative prose, so basically telling a story through the art of poetry, even though I'm definitely not a poet. But I'm also a massive, massive fangirl of Edgar Allan Poe. That was my first fandom. It was the first time I ever heard of an Easter egg in a book, because in 5th grade, 6th grade, very, very long time ago, before the internet, like back when we had to like a like meant you like somebody. There was no like upvoting. It just meant you like stood up straight at the polling place. Yes, it's okay. Bad puns are still puns. And we had this book called 10 Great Mysteries by Edgar Allan Poe, which was a collection of a few of his short stories. And there was a table of contents, so it was like The Black Cat and Metzinger Stein and like The Telltale Heart and all the classics. And they were all in the table of contents. But if you finish the last story, which I believe was Tale of Ragged Mountains, and you turn the page, there was a bunch of poems. Like, they weren't in the table of contents. It was like, hey, here's some extra stuff. Because, I mean, I guess they figured, hey, it's the 80s, and if you're the weird kid who's reading Poe for fun, you're probably gonna like some more Poe. So they gave more Poe, and that's why I found Annabel Lee, which, in my humble opinion, is the greatest collection of English words ever assembled. If you're not familiar, definitely check it out. I think even if you go to YouTube, I think Sir Ian McKellen, there's a recording of him reading it, which is just phenomenal. It's like beautiful voice, beautiful words, fantastic. This is not that. But in aping my influences, I hope to do a little bit of fun. And I even got to do a little bit of painting. So actually don't be kind. My own kids were kind of like, yeah, Dad, don't do that anymore. So, but this is a bedtime poem called Charles. Charles walked down the street so long, his feet were tired, his breath not strong. His mother warned, stay away, don't roam. From the alien side, just come straight home. But Charles couldn't resist the curious spell. He wanted to see where those creatures dwelled. All his schoolmates had a peek and a glance. So Charles dashed off as soon as he had the chance. To his surprise, the streets were bare, no aliens around, not a soul to stare. He searched and searched, but it wasn't right, just squiggly signs, such a puzzling sight. As the darkness fell, the cold bit deep. Charles wished for home, warm blankets, and sleep. But as he turned the corner, oh, what a dread. An alien lurked, filling him with dread. I'm gonna pause for a second. Yes, I rhymed dread with dread, because poetry is hard. Hidden in shadows, a few steps behind, no details visible but a chill in his mind, Charles tried to hurry, his heart skipping a beat, but the alien followed him down the street. His feet were cold, he couldn't move any faster, and calling out for help might lead to disaster. He trudged bravely forward, his gaze straight ahead, the alien's footsteps filling him with dread. Yep, there's dread again. You know why? It's a good word, and it rhymes with a lot of stuff. He imagined long arms, slimy and slick, and hot alien breath on the back of his neck. But throughout the journey, the alien stayed, hidden in shadows, in the darkness swayed. Finally, he made it home. After running for so long, he turned around, hoping that the alien was gone. But to his horror, the alien was still near, waiting in shadows and filling him with fear. No words were spoken, just one long, slimy finger, shaking in warning, making Charles linger. Darkness grew, enveloping the space, surrounding Charles in a cold, chilling embrace. Charles tried to run, but his legs were bound. By the alien's dark magic, no escape could be found. Charles cried and cried, tears streaming down his cheeks, calling out for his mother, hoping she'd see. But she could not hear him. No one could, no one came. Poor little Charles could never be saved. So remember this fable for the rest of your days. You should always listen to what mothers say. Yeah, which is great. If you got like a 6-year-old, you should read that right before bedtime. Oh, fantastic. It puts them right out. So this is like in a music set, this is where we get to what's called the climax, the closing piece. 3 years ago, I wanted to challenge myself because I don't like what I call one-day guys, which are, we all know them. They're like, oh, one day I'm going to start that cupcake shop. One day I'm going to go back to school and do yada, yada, yada. One day I'm going to whatever. But that one day never comes. I'm also not a huge fan of people who talk trash without backing it up. For the longest time, was not a fan of fantasy. Wasn't like opposed to it as a genre. It just wasn't for me because everything I'd read and everything I was exposed to was too similar, very homogenous. Like, I like Tolkien, sure, but I don't need to see hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pages of Tolkien fanfic. It's always white guys with English accents on horses and carrying swords, and it's sort of this like historically inaccurate Renaissance festival with magic and that kind of stuff. And it's all based in Arthurian legend, which King Arthur, that's where we get that term, which is fine. England's great, it's a cool country. You know, a couple days ago, we celebrated those treasonous pricks who like separated us from them, but that's neither here nor there. Yeah, hashtag King George was right. And there's so many other countries with so much other folklore from which to draw from. And so I made myself a list of about 13 tropes. Things like, you know, there's always like some buffy, handsome white fella who rides a horse and he carries a sword and he has an old mentor who trains him up in the ways of old and ancient, and there's spells and a quest and there's lots of dragons. Dragons are cool, but there are literally millions of mythological creatures. We always go back to dragons, so I said no dragons. I also never really got the hang of the whole thing of why the hero is basically a psychopathic murderer. Take a contemporary example. George R.R. Martin did a great series, The Song of Ice and Fire, which was adapted to Game of Thrones. You might have heard of it, little indie picture, little production. Some people talked about it. It got a thing. It was all about these people who tried to take down Cersei, the heroic queen who was just protecting her family because she really loved her family. Like, really, really loved her family. But everything that was happening in Game of Thrones, like, everyone was a killer. Like, they would murder someone, and sometimes they'd be a little upset about it, but then they would get over it, like, within the next page. And the same thing in other, like, subgenres of fantasy, like Walking Dead. I have to kill someone who I love. Like, this is a traumatic moment for me. And then they pull the trigger, they kill the zombie, who used to be their mom or their friend or whatever. They'll stare into the distance for about 18 seconds, and then they're fine. Either they never talk about it again, or they just really like killing and become this badass like killing machine. And it's like, that's gross. I mentioned, and now it's going to ruin your afternoon for a little bit. So I used to work in broadcasting, and my beat, which was my assignment, was missing persons most wanted. And the gallows humor we had was that no one's missing because they took a last-minute vacation. No one's most wanted because they're just so effing charismatic. It was the worst of mankind day after day. And so I had grown a pretty strong aversion to the glorification of violence, because actual violence is not cool. It is not stylish. It doesn't make you hip or important or powerful. It is a gross abomination of life by definition. And so even though a lot of my books and a lot of the content does tend to be violent, I think you'll find that it's not gratuitous, nor is it stylized, it's not celebrated. It's usually either a necessity or to demonstrate how deplorable a character or a group of characters are. Particularly when it came to young women. So the thing that made me leave broadcasting, and I promise this has a happy ending, so don't worry, it's gonna get really dark. So just come on with me, it's a fun ride. It's like Space Mountain back before they put all the safety rails in and you thought you were gonna hit your head. But I got a call from my boss who was like, hey, there's a Amber Alert for a young lady. She's about 6 years old, and the cops think they found her remains, which already that sentence, even if you don't know anything about journalism, you know that people being referred to as remains is usually not a good sign. So I packed up the gear and headed out and got to the scene, and she had been dismembered. And I will spare you more details because there's a lot of stuff there. But the cops had found the person who did it, which was nice, at least as far as closure is concerned. And it was the young woman's father, because there was a custody dispute. And rather than, I don't know, not murder and dismember his daughter, he had kidnapped her, heard about the Amber Alert, and then to cover his tracks, decided to commit murder. So seeing that, I was like, you know what, I'm good. No more of this, can't handle this. I was in my early 20s, and I was like, that was a little too real. And that's when I jumped into broadcasting, which is a whole, or jumped out of broadcasting, which is a whole other story for another panel, and less fun. But because of that, I got to know firsthand that one, most criminals are super dumb. And when I say criminals, I mean people who are actively committing crimes. And when I mean crimes, are things like violent crimes. Like you can definitely justify theft. You can justify selling illegal narcotics. Because certain situations, especially the way our society is set up, have made those conditions kind of the only option for a lot of people. You can never justify murder. You definitely can never justify child murder. So one of the things I really wanted to do, one of the most important tropes in my list of things to avoid when writing fantasy, was that my hero was going to be an absolute pacifist. She was never, ever going to take anyone's life, because another character trait she has is that she's brilliant. And smart people don't commit crimes, because as we established 18 seconds ago, criminals are stupid. First book went over well. I drew from a lot of Ghanaian, country of Ghana, their mythology. I pulled a lot from French mythology because, again, even though King George was right, he was also kind of an asshole. So, you know, hashtag F England, go France, which has a lot of mythology too that's not Arthurian. And then also just weird stuff I came up with, because the thing about fantasy is that it can be anything. So if you take nothing away from this, just remember, they used to call me white girl in college. So to balance it out, though, there's a lot of characters. So the first book, oh, that's right, I'm supposed to pitch this. See, this is what's gonna have notes. So all 3 books in the trilogy are available to download for free this weekend at CONvergence. If you go to Amazon.com, I know we don't want to feed the Bezos beast, but it's a really easy delivery platform. The Unbodied, the Unbanished, and the Unrested are all free to download if you use ebooks. But the third one is the Unbodied. And so to give you a quick recap, it takes place in a fictional, I guess you figured that out when I said fantasy, a country called Helene Javari. And Helene Javari, in the first book, undergoes this grand revolution. Oriane leads the people, and they take down like the social hierarchy and the very strictly adhered to caste system. And then now everything's great. Oriane picks up a friend who turned out to be a fan, that's a strong word, a reader favorite, named Marie Lepierre. And yes, I'm definitely gonna butcher this French accent. But what's funny is in Minnesota, people hear my normal speaking voice, not my affectation with the vocal trill, but my actual speaking voice. And I've been asked if I was from France, I've been asked if I'm from England, I suspect it's because I don't look like I should speak like this. Like, yeah, I like Jamba Juice. I like pumpkin spice lattes. This is what happens when you drink Jamba Juice and pumpkin spice lattes. Yeah. Is this recording? Hey, everybody watching the thingy? So the theme of this year's CONvergence is everyone's invited, which has a strong thing about equity and equality. And you might hear some jerks talk about gay panic, right? And LGBTQ yada yada, how it's contagious. I will tell you firsthand, gay is not contagious. Suburban white girl is contagious. Because the only people who don't like Jamba Juice and pumpkin spice lattes are people who have never had Jamba Juice or pumpkin spice lattes. Those shits are delicious. So now that the promo is out of the way, in the second book we follow Marie Lapierre, and she is what's called a shell skin. She trades skin for shells. She is kind of the antithesis of Oriane, whereas Oriane is all about peace and making sure they can find a non-violent solution to everything. Marie's like, nah, F that, I will just stab them. And because stabbing things tends to resolve the situation pretty quickly. Kind of like Wonder Woman. That's right, Wonder Woman is psychotic and a murderer, and I love her for it anyway. She is the exception to my rule. She is my hall pass. I know she's fictional, but those are just details. And Marie, we follow her because readers tend to dig her, and like, what do you do if you are a killer for hire and there's no one to kill? Like, what is your life involve? What do you do when all of your skills are around taking breath from other people? And so that's where that story goes. And then The Unbodied picks up right at the end of The Unrested, which was released just a few weeks ago. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. I'm just going to read the back because I love it when they get these little descriptions because I could never come up with this stuff. So I pay people on Fiverr and they like read it and they're like, this is what it is. I'm like, yeah, you say so. In the enthralling third chapter of the atmospheric Afro-fantasy epic, Oriane Duchamp and Marie the One-Woman Plague, yeah, that's her nickname, kind of badass, confront their most formidable challenge yet. Return to a world. Ooh, I should do trailer voice. Return to a world where the stakes are as high as the magic is dark and wondrous. As you settle in, prepare to be left on the edge of your seat, breathless from the sheer force of a story that refuses to let go. That guy earned his $10, let me tell you. As you have said it, so let it be so. So in this excerpt, to bring you up to speed, there we go. We are with two characters, Rinjoris and Dahlia, and they have arrived at a place, and things are going to happen. And oh, look at that, I am on time. Hell yeah. Hey, Phil, how's it going? 20 paces past the first intersection, Rinjoris encountered a figure whose haggard appearance was as desolate as the port itself. Clad in filthy, tattered garments with wild hair and an even wilder expression, he emerged from the shadows like a specter. Sir, I am called Gaspar Barrett. Might I extend my services for your noble vessel? He rasped, his voice a dry leaf skittering across the cobblestones. Rinjoris, taken aback by the sudden appearance of another, steadied himself. The desolation of Jadiel Port had prepared him for many things, but not for the company of a man who seemed as much a part of the port's shadows as the darkness itself. He assessed the man with a discerning eye of one who had navigated both the treacherous waters of the sea and the equally perilous currents of human nature. Age had not just touched Gaspar Barrett, it had claimed him. The passage of countless nights had bowed him. The hands that offered their services bore the tremors of time, not the steadiness of vigor. No thank you, Gaspar, Rinjoris stated without malice, his tone laced with regret for the necessity of refusal. Our journey requires strengths you lack. Tell me, Gaspar, what fate befell this port? Jadiel, Gaspar replied. Oh, that which awaits us. This is why I need to use the mic stand, because page turns. There we go. And that is, all from origination is subject to cessation. Well, you quote the progenitors like a scholar, Rinjoris smirked. Were you once of the Enlightenment stratum, perhaps a tutor or an instructor? Ah, Gaspar shook his head. If that is the service you seek, I've accumulated many tales and secrets from my time drawing breath. Let me join you as your boatswain, and I promise wealth beyond measure in stories and sagacity. My wisdom could be your riches. Riches? Rinjoris scoffed, skepticism lacing his tone. Your tales are of no use without the strength to back them. I must decline once more. Well, then perhaps you'd be interested. in a ruby-encrusted calabash, my most treasured possession. You have a ruby-encrusted calabash, Rinjoris laughed. Yeah, and I can wield the magic in my sleep. I understand your mockery, Gaspar retorted, but I am no mere fabulist. I am a veteran of Erebus. I served in the Squall, trained by Skinner Hakim Adisi himself. The calabash was plundered during the Second Visitant Uprising in Umadan, events that predate your first breath by at least 12,000 nights. Well, apologies, Elder Baird. I meant no disrespect, Rinjoris answered. But why part with such a treasured relic? Well, my past is past, Gaspar demurred. I cannot earn shells on my deeds and wisdom, but in your hands, the calabash might yet yield profit. Desperation and hunger alone drive me to this exchange. If you will not enlist me on your vessel, then allow this transaction so that I may acquire enough shells to finance my own exodus. Oh, as you have said it, Rinjoris nodded. Rinjoris followed Gaspar through the empty streets deeper into the shallow crevices of Jadiel Port until they reached a decrepit rondavel. As he stepped over the threshold, his nose was immediately assaulted by the mask of mold, the tang of rust, the stench of tarnished metal, and the unmistakable odor of vermin. Aside from the odor, navigating the shop was akin to traversing the debris of a shipwreck. It was a labyrinthine mess that defied logic. Shelves, if they could still be called that, bowed under the weight of dust-laden tomes stacked haphazardly beside tarnished trinkets. Cobwebs adorned every nook, cradling the detritus in their silken threads. Every step stirred up clouds of dust, sending motes dancing in the scant rays of light that slipped through the grime-coated windows. The gleam of metal and the dull sheen of glass hinted at treasures real or imagined. It was a repository for the discarded and disavowed, lacking any distinctions between worth and waste. Here, Gaspar gestured toward a begrimed chest rotting near a pile of dingy tapestries. Be kind to an elder and reach down to retrieve it from the chest. My spine is not so sturdy as yours. Rinjoris smiled weakly and obliged. Kneeling onto the smudged and grubby floor, he reached out, withdrew the chest, and pushed the lid open. In the dim light, the truth of the calabash was revealed. It wasn't a bejeweled calabash, but instead a rotted yam, its dignity assaulted by shards of shattered wine bottles. Rinjoris laughed reflexively. Such a ridiculous ruse. Surely Gaspar didn't truly believe that anyone would mistake this foul gourd for a genuine treasure. And that's when he realized the yam wasn't the ruse, it was a distraction. He turned swiftly, just as Gaspar's hand was reaching for his coin pouch. Rinjoris, seasoned by a life of concentration with deceit, caught Gaspar's wrist and squeezed, forcing the old man to his knees. Did you think me a fool? Rinjoris demanded. Please, Gaspar begged. I am infirmed and on the brink of starvation. Aren't we all? Rinjoris retorted with a snarl. You thought to play me for the fool with a rotting yam as your stage and my shells as the prize. Did you imagine I'd turn a blind eye to your treachery? That I would be so doltish that I would not notice your fraudulence? Please, Gaspar's plea was a whisper frantic and laced with fear. Keep your voice down. Why? Rinjoris roared with incredulous disbelief. And to whom would my voice carry in this forsaken port? Do you fear the judgment of the shadows? His jest was cut short as the rondavel trembled, dislodging puffs of grime and secrets in a cloud of dust and spores. Caught off guard by the tremor, Rinjoris' grip slackened. Seizing the moment, Gaspar scrambled, skittering across the floor like an insect. He sought refuge among the tattered tapestries that draped the shop's walls. I tried to warn you, Gaspar wailed, his voice muffled by layers of neglect. I tried to warn you. Before Rinjoris could demand clarity, a voice, familiar and laced with urgency, cut through. Dahlia was calling for him, her tone suggesting that the stakes had risen far beyond the immediate altercation. The rondavel trembled once more, a foreboding prelude to what was to come. With a reluctant resolve, Rinjoris held Gaspar from his makeshift burrow. As they emerged, Rinjoris' gaze snapped to the horizon, where a sight both magnificent and terrifying unfolded. A monstrous horned shell broke through the mist, dwarfing the surrounding desolation. Carcoal, Rinjoris muttered in stunned horror. Unhand me, Gaspar cried, fighting futilely against Rinjoris' iron grip. His voice was thick with panic. To the pier! Sorry. So, when I write, I see the characters in my head, and I see them right now, and this is a lot of fun. No, Gaspar spat his refusal. You roused the beast. It is yours to confront. Lead me to the pier, Rinjoris repeated, his voice a thunderclap of resolve, and I'll grant you passage on my vessel, the Paramus. As if to punctuate the urgency of their plight, the head of the carcole emerged into view, a nightmarish bulk of muscle and slime with a quintet of grotesque eye stalks snaking through the darkness. Each of the 5 milky orbs swept over the crumbling buildings with a disconcerting deliberation, seeking the faintest stir of inky venom, gushed from its maw, splattering across the alleyways and turning stone to sludge. Rinjoris unleashed a string of curses as the shadow of annihilation crept closer. With a final look of contempt, he ran off down the street. Gaspar, stripped of his bravado, darted back into the collapsing shop, his heart hammering as he pawed through the wreckage. His fingers closed around the grubby chest, the damp wood creaking under the pressure, and he yanked it free, ignoring the rotten stench of the yam hidden inside. Clutching his dubious treasure, he sprinted to catch up to Rinjoris. Behind them, the carcole gave chase, its gargantuan body thundering through the shattered cobblestones, the venomous quills the size of garden trees along its spiked shell glistening in the dim light. Its shadow fell over the port like a pall, its grotesque form blotting out the sun as it flung its quills through the air like harpoons, striking the ground around Rinjoris and Gaspar with earth-shattering force. Their frantic pace led them down a narrow alley, only to end abruptly at a crumbling wall. A dead end. The ground trembled as the carcole drew nearer, just as its milky gaze settled upon the terrified pair. A shadow darted above. Out of the darkened clouds, a figure swooped down, a cloaked figure atop an elephant, the mighty winged elephant beating its massive wings against the air with the power of a tempest. The elephant raised its trunk and let loose a trumpeting cry as it engaged the carcole. With a primal roar, the monstrous snail reared back, its milky eyes focusing on this new threat as it launched a barrage of quills in a deadly flurry. The elephant wheeled and twisted, dodging each projectile, its colossal body weaving through the air with surprising grace. As the carcole reared up, the rider leaped from their perch. With a heart-stopping plunge, she drove down to the elephant. They descended swiftly, cloak fluttering behind them, disappearing behind the snail's horned head. The monster slashed and roared, its quills flailing, its cries filling the air until it suddenly went rigid. The giant creature collapsed with a thunderous crash, shaking the earth as it fell. The elephant descended, landing heavily upon the carcole's head with a crushing blow. Dust billowed, and in the silence that followed, the cloaked rider slid down from the carcole's carcass and stepped forward, patting the elephant's side as they emerged from the settling cloud. The silence was broken by the sound of Gaspar's faint thud as he collapsed in a swoon. Rinjoris, overcome with relief and awe, fell to his knees. "I am indebted to you, stranger." Rinjoris' voice was hoarse with gratitude. "I am Rinjoris. To whom do I owe my existence?" The rider reached up and pulled back her hood and wiped the viscous carcole mucin from her garments. "My name is Marie Lapierre," she replied. "Many thanks, Marie." Rinjoris bowed his head respectfully. "I only draw breath now because of your astonishing feat of lethality, slaying the dreaded carcole." "That animal wasn't dreaded, it was frightened," Marie spat. "And I didn't slay it, just rendered it unconscious. She still draws breath, and she's going to be angry when she wakes up, though. You'd best explain why you're here, and do so quickly." Oh, I got more time. "My wife," Rinjoris straightened up, urgency threading his void, "and I have been at sea for countless nights seeking a road to Demi-Circle." Marie scoffed dismissively, cutting through the fog of his plea with a cold clarity. "This is not Demi-Circle. This is Jardiel, a sanctuary for creatures born of magic, and for Gaspar, who is beside his wits and refuses to leave." At that moment, Dahlia arrived, her stride purposeful and her presence immediately commanding. She silenced Rinjoris with a sharp glance before locking her gaze on Marie. Recognition sparked in her eyes. "The one-woman plague," she declared, her tone mixing reverence with a tinge of provocation. The famed Shellskin herself. Oh, we are honored." "Shellskins don't exist anymore," Marie bristled at the old moniker, her hands clenching unconsciously. "And even if they did, it's not who I am, not anymore." "But you are remarkable, Marie," Dahlia pressed on undeterred. "It must be a sin squandering your gifts in self-imposed exile, tending to creatures as a glorified keeper of the zoo instead of shaping world events at the edge of a blade." "The world doesn't need my gifts," Marie's retort was laced with bitterness. "And even if it did, as I said, my heart's no longer in it." Dahlia, sensing a crack in Marie's emotionally armored facade, softened her approach, probing deeper. "Did you truly choose to sheath your blade? Was laying aside your talents a matter of option or resort, Marie? Or was it perhaps because of other circumstances? Did life decide for you, or perhaps the loss of someone close?" Marie's silence was more telling than any words could be, confirming Dahlia's suspicions. Dahlia, perceiving the confirmation in Marie's averted gaze, shifted her strategy from empathy to necessity. She nudged Rinjoris, urging him to join the conversation. "Might we impose on your hospitality to rest here for a few nights before we continue our search?" he asked. We would stay aboard our ship, of course, Dahlia quickly added. We seek not to burden you, but rather moments of peace to properly mourn what we have lost. Marie considered this, her features softening. Her expression remained unreadable as she mulled over the request. It had been ages since she had interacted with anyone besides Gaspar, and the isolation weighed on her more than she cared to admit. You may stay, Marie conceded, but not on your ship. You must join me in my home. As you have said it, Dahlia's smile was a mixture of triumph and genuine worth, so let it be so. Thank you so much. So I noticed I have just a teensy bit more time, and I realized, so in between the chapters of the books, the trilogy, because it's fantasy, instead of doing like a glossary at the end to explain things, which is common practice, or footnotes, which is super annoying and no fun. I mean, for those of us who had college, footnotes, they suck. Kind of like college, yeah. So in between the chapters in the first one, there are the lessons of tutelage, because it's from Oriane's perspective, and she is going tutelage because she starts as a little kid, and tutelage is just how they learn. And so we get her notes as kind of like these little interstitials. And then we return to that in the Embodied, because now Oriane is all grown up, and she's kind of a badass, with the Scroll of Conversance. And the Scrolls of Conversance serve the same purpose. They offer footnotes and glossary stuff. And so they give you more of a peek into the world of Helene Jevary and the Unbodied, the Unbanished, and the Unrested. This is, I think I've got time for this. If I don't, I'll read really, really fast. This is the Scroll of Conversance, the Hierarchy of Governance. So these are like the rules and the notes about the world. Now, before the transformative waves of the Grand Revolution reshaped the landscape of Helene Jevary, the governance structure was rigorously hierarchical, intricately layered with tiers of power that determined not just political, but also social standing. At the apex of this hierarchy were the chieftains, a triumvirate of leadership classes composed of bronze, silver, and gold tiers, each signifying escalating levels of authority and privilege. The gold chieftain, despite being the lowest tier within the grouping, held significant sway, overshadowed only by the more influential silver and bronze chieftains. Now, directly beneath the chieftains were the queen mothers, who administered the governance of cities, ports, and villages across the realm. These matriarchs were supported by the elders, who were seasoned advisors, who consulted closely with the queen mothers to ensure wise and effective governance. Now, the societal structure was further delineated into 4 stratums, which, while ostensibly equal, experienced a de facto hierarchy influenced by proximity to power and access to resources, a lot like the United States of America. Yes, so you might remember from the other excerpt, Ren Joris inquiring as to whether or not Gaspar might have been of the Enlightenment stratum. Here's these stratums. The stratums are as follows. Unir. This stratum consisted of politicians and strategists centered in the capital region of Courbon. It was subdivided into aristos, the top tier, patricians, and attendants, with aristos wielding considerable influence within the political sphere. Then there's the Vaincre, comprising warriors and weapons crafters. This stratum was based in the militant region of Tollerbella. The hierarchy within the Vaincre includes skinners, top tier, schemers, and searchers, with skinners renowned for their prowess and strategic importance in defense and warfare. Then there's the explorateurs, or explorators, as my youngest was called them, tasked with mapping the natural world and constructing vital infrastructure. Explorateurs were primarily stationed in the wild expanses of Ardwood. Their ranks include venturers, top tier, pathfinders, and wayfarers, with venturers leading explorations and pioneering new territories. Then there's the Enlightenment strategy, or if I want to be an asshole about it, the Enlightenment. This stratum was dedicated to the preservation of knowledge and education, congregating in the scholarly region of Navanka. Now, dominis were the top tier, with tutors and instructors forming the educational backbone, passing on wisdom and nurturing future generations. Now, following the Grand Revolution, the rigid stratum system was dismantled in favor of a council. This new governance model was led by queen mothers and elders, with each member enjoying equal legal authority, though traditionally the eldest queen mother often received deferential respect. The dissolution of the stratum hierarchy marked a significant cultural shift, formally integrating the Clonovo into broader society and removing caste-based barriers. This created a fluid social dynamic where individuals were no longer confirmed by birth, but could aspire to roles that matched their capabilities and ambitions. In contemporary Helene Javari, social stratification is more nuanced, largely influenced by regional affiliations and economic status. Those in resource-rich areas typically wield greater influence, having easier access to the council's attention, whereas individuals from the less affluent backgrounds faced more significant challenges. Now, despite lingering inequities, the council system is hailed for its promotion of equality and the opportunity it provides for every citizen to shape their destiny. This framework supports a society where personal achievement and network can potentially elevate one's status, aligning with the progressive ideals that fueled the Grand Revolution. The shift from a rigidly hierarchical society to one with a more democratic governance structure illustrates Helene Javari's ongoing evolution, striving toward a system that values and uplifts all citizens equally. It's so much fun, the world building. So, thank you. So we've come to the last 15 minutes. And for those of you who are here from the beginning, you understand why this is funny. For those of you who just got here, you're like, what? That's T, and that's how he talks. Like, I've met him in the hallways. I've seen him at Smoker's Paradise. He's very, T-Rexy. Because, like, Alexis Rose is definitely my Patronus, or less problematic stand-in for Spirit Animal. But this is where I can open up for questions, and this is my favorite part, because I have a wireless, and I can come see you. It sucks for you guys watching on the video. Is anybody watching? Do you have, like, a view count? No? Because then we can make this like the adults only portion of the show. Not like in a gross way, but like, because this is chaos under here. Like this is all like the polyester facade, don't be fooled. Underneath it, it's fucking Armageddon. But yes, are there any questions from the audience? Not just about the books, just in general. Let's chat. Oh, let's rap, as the teachers used to say back in my day. Yes.
The section that you read earlier, where you had the characters sort of prying into Marie's background, is that the characters asking the question, or are you kind of being curious and sort of asking the questions through the characters?
Good question. So in that particular excerpt, it's in universe. That is the characters prying into Marie's background, mostly because, one, I also fell in love with Marie, even though I'm an absolute pacifist, and Marie is an absolute anti-pacifist. What is the opposite of a pacifist? A baby? A baby, yes. But and the short answer is also, so Marie is the feature of the second book in the trilogy, and we get a lot of detail and background about her. And she was a lot of fun to write, because I got to use a lot of those things that I like to see in non-male, non-white characters, which is she's not driven by romance. And even though she's physically appealing, perhaps to some, no one cares, because it doesn't matter how hot or not hot someone is if they're throwing daggers at your face. I mean, I don't kink shame, but in general, that's usually a little bit lower on the priority list of interests. Yes, thank you. That's a good question. Are there any other questions? Is everyone having a good? I can start asking you guys questions, and I mean, they can be really fun. Have you been enjoying Con? Yeah. What's been your favorite part so far, besides this reading, of course? The cosplays. Okay. I mean, I see a fantastic Baker doctor, like right here. Oh, there's a camera operator too? So when I move, you move? Just like that? Oh, this is super groovy. Do you mind if we put you on camera? So this is the sixth Doctor, who was played by Colin Baker. It was a lovely, lovely suit, even though he was done dirty by the BBC, because he did not get along well with the suits, and as things go, they truncated his run. But if you haven't seen Colin Baker, you should definitely go look up those episodes. They're fantastic. Also, another plug, there's an event. Can we plug other events at this event? Hey, cool. Please don't cancel me, CONvergence. There's a great Doctor Who convention called Console Room every January, and this coming January, one of the guests of honor is Colin Baker. Wait, what? Yeah. Very, very groovy. They got table, they've got flyers around, or check out console-room.com. And then they've got all the info. It's a really cool thing. It is ostensibly a Whovian convention, but they have other interests as well that span the whole gamut. So fantasy, sci-fi, books, all that fun stuff. And yeah, but I should probably get back to the writing, right? This is a reading. Yes. If there are no further questions, which looks like they're not. Oh, great, never mind.
So you mentioned being maybe ambivalent at best about fantasy before writing these? How do you feel now that you have written some fantasy? Did that change your perspective on fantasy, or how do you feel about it now?
Ooh, that's another great question. I'm gonna take you with me everywhere. This is fantastic. So, oddly enough, so having written 3 fantasy novels now, I am a bigger fan of fantasy with the caveat that it's well-written fantasy. Because it turns out what I was being exposed to was just a matter of like limited options. Because people are like, hey, you don't like fantasy? You should read Aragon. I was like, okay, what's it about? Dragons. I'm like, cool. All right, what else you got? And like, like, have you heard of Song of Ice and Fire? Like, that's a cool title. It sounds like a Metallica album. What's it about? Dragons. Like, okay. But now having discovered it and even digging deeper into things that even aren't necessarily classified as fantasy because genres are a little weird anyway, a lot of Afrofuturism, even though it gets that blanket umbrella term, really does have a lot of elements that will fall underneath the fantasy category. So Nnedi Okorafor, Octavia Butler, Marlon James especially, I think he's local, or at least he's been to the Twin Cities quite often, and his novels are fantastically written. They are classified as Afrofuturism because his SPF is like mine, about 25, 30, but they're really, really well done. I mean, another disclaimer, it doesn't matter how light or dark your skin complexion is, you should be wearing sunblock because that big ball of radiation in the sky doesn't give a shit about race. Yes. But yes, I have definitely opened up, especially fantasy adaptations have been interesting. I've noticed that there are not as many quality ones. There's a lot of content, I think, because of that little independent production Game of Thrones that like ushered in a lot more green lights for certain things, but I would not say they're all equal, which is not very profound. Most entertainment media is good and not as good. Try not to judge art. There's definitely some where you're kind of like, wow, that was 2 hours, I'm not gonna get back. Or novels where you're like, oof, they should have left that one a tree. Cool, are there any other questions? Oh, hey, it's you again. How's it going?
Okay. You had me at Tank Girl and Wonder Woman mashup. Where do we get a hold of the Billy Badass books again? Where do we get a hold of the Billy Badass books again?
Oh, yes. So Billy Badass, it was just one novel, and it was my first. And I can tell this story. This is a lot of fun. So that book is my first novel. It's called Teleportality, which portmanteau of teleporting and, I mean, in my head, reality. But that's actually not a good portmanteau. But it rolls off the tongue nicely. And they're all available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Bone Shaker Books on the West Bank if you live in Minneapolis has those issues, and then also with a lot of indies, they can order anything. So if you're from out of town, don't like Amazon, don't like Barnes & Noble, or just have a preferred bookshop, usually they can order them pretty quickly. The thing about Teleportality, speaking of that great title, is I am a big nerd, which I know I hide it super well. And a lot of my titles were kind of like when you write like a doctorate. Like no one ever writes their dissertation and they're like, all right, here's my paper on kids getting stronger by drinking milk. It's always like the impact of lactose intake on juveniles, age blah, blah, blah. And for some reason that's like seeped into me. So my first few novels are like Teleportality and Dragon Variation, which is literally named after my favorite chess opening, the Sicilian Dragon Variation, which is amazing, it's badass. Like people talk about Endgame, the Marvel movie, that's nothing, because the real Endgame was Kasparov versus Karpov. It is the most thrilling chess match if you like chess. Otherwise, it is 5 hours of 2 old white guys pushing pieces around a board. And then I followed up Dragon Variation with The Preternaturalist, at which point a good friend of mine, Karina, who we call Teaspoon, she and I were talking, and I was like, people seem to like what I'm doing, but I do get complaints about my titles, but I don't know how else to title them. And so for my next series, which was an allegory serial, because again, nerdy kid, I used to read those old pulp novels at the library, and I wanted to do my take on that. Also doing my take on an alien invasion story, except the aliens weren't malevolent and they weren't beneficial, they were just ambivalent. Because the metaphor I use is like when we cut down a rainforest or start knocking over stuff to build condominiums, which are popping up like freaking Starbucks all over the place now, we don't care about the ants. And if aliens have the kind of technology that lets them travel like interstellar, we're ants. And she was like, that sounds kind of interesting. What do you calling it? I was like, well, my working title is The Perspicacious Rise of Javari. And she's like, nope, it is not. And I was like, well, what can it be? Well, she's like, well, give me the log line. Give me the elevator pitch. What is it about in one sentence? I was like, well, okay, so there are these big-ass aliens that she's like, stop, that's your title. And because I do a lot of indie publishing, I have full control. So I was like, you know what? Fuck you, Karina. I'm going to name it Big Ass Aliens. And when nobody buys it, I'm coming back and laughing in your face. That book for 2 years was my best-selling freaking novel. Like, people would come to me at cons and reading events, and they would look at my stuff. They'd hear me do readings with all my, like, 50-cent words and, like, these expansive worlds. And, like, ooh, does that say big-ass aliens? It's like, oh. And, yes, so that's the very roundabout way of my titles. And so now I try and strike a balance. So, like, the series was fun, because there was, like, the Unrested. Because I am still one of those nerds that back in the analog days, I used to have a word-a-day calendar. And so it's a really hard place because I really like words. I love etymology and I just love vocabulary and like all that stuff. But like, please don't tell me I'm articulate unless we're in a very specific conversation. But now I follow wordaday.com, which every day sends me an email with a new word, and it's a lot of fun. I was like, ooh, unrested, what does that mean? Because even though I'm a nerd, I'm not the brightest crayon in the box. Unrested means the opposite of rest. It means, yeah, you add an ED, and I was baffled. It was crazy.
I apologize, I'm sort of late to the party, but I was wondering, you'd mentioned something about Afrofuturism, a lot of those books also sort of being fantasy books, but not being called fantasy. I'm curious if you have any thoughts or if that's an interesting thing to think about for you, do you think it's nice that Afrofuturism is its own genre? Do you feel like its relationship with fantasy is interesting? Is all the interesting fantasy actually Afrofuturism? Can you comment?
Absolutely. I want to quote Charles Mingus, because again, nerd, I like jazz. I can't, though, because he uses some slurs that even back then were kind of like, dude, don't say that. But his description of genres, he was a famous jazz bassist / composer, and they used to ask him, like, you know, like, why do you get angry when people put you in jazz times and jazz magazines, you find your records in the jazz section of the store? And he was saying that, I gotta clean this up, that genres were invented by expletive, racial slur for person of Jewish descent to make a lot of, basically he was saying it was created for selling things. So I think that the classification is not necessarily a bad thing. I do think that because when you use Afrofuturism as a label, it kind of gives you an idea that at the very least that you're gonna get something that's not part of the status quo. It is possible for people who are not part of the global majority to write Afrofuturism. However, a lot of the big names are. For example, Octavia Butler and Eddie Korfor, all those folks, they're kind of like me. Like, if I saw them in like a 23andMe, I wouldn't be very surprised. I'm like, oh, yeah, all right, right on. Speaking of which, quick side note, don't do those DNA tests. They're $100 a pop. If you give me $50, I will absolutely tell you that you are related to your ancestors. But as far as like the classifications from those subgenres, anything more than that, like I think it's just enough to separate it out by telling you who the author is rather than what the contents contain. Because if you think about one of the classic genre conventions, science fiction, what is science fiction? Like, there are how many billions of different types of science fiction? If you read McCormack's The Road and then you go read H.G. Wells' Time Machine, those are both science fiction, both extremely different books, extremely different writing styles, different plots, different character tropes. You read D.C. Edwards' Bright City, that's completely different than, like, so I think anything more than using it to classify, oh, this author writes science fiction, so you're probably not gonna find like two werewolf bros like stroking big Shetland pony on their ranch, but you will find other genre tropes. I mean, if you have strong feelings about genre or classifications or labels, that's fine. I just ask you one challenging question: what is YA? And like I don't have an answer. Like, when I was a kid growing up, we read stuff like Catcher in the Rye, which sucked. Sorry, any fan boys or girls in here who dig Catcher in the Rye, but Holden Caulfield is a piece of shit, and I don't understand why that's a classic American novel. But that, technically, right, that's a YA novel. So would Anthony Burgess' A Clockwork Orange, because it has a teenage protagonist in a semi-dystopian world doing bad things to people. I mean, that's basically just like the Divergent series with better prose. If you're a fan of Divergent, that's fine. You should just, there is better stuff out there. Just throwing it out there. But I hope that kind of answers or comments appropriately. We're down to the last 60 seconds, and what I want to do, in addition to being respectful for your time, is just thank you so much for coming out. Because as a local author and a largely indie author, I do have published stuff, but I like my indie gives me a lot more freedom to kind of do what you want. It's a little punk rock. It's really awesome to see folks come out. And even if you didn't dig it, the fact that you came and sat for an hour just means the world. You're all amazing. You look incredible. Like, holy crap, on a scale of 1 to 10, a solid 98's all he is. Take that how you will. I'm not objectifying. I'm just observing, just saying. And I do have a meet and greet tomorrow at some time. I want to say 4. That feels right. But if not, I'm in the CVG book schedule, all the things. Or if you got other stuff going on, that's great. If you see me around con, please feel free to stop by, say hello. I love meeting new folks, and especially folks like you. So thank you very much.